Quinn adjusted his hood as he navigated the twisted alleys of Sura, where the streets were as filthy as the dealings taking place within them. The planet had a reputation across the sector as a haven for criminals, smugglers, and all sorts of shady characters. He had come in search of an artifact, an ancient object supposedly infused with powers that some claimed could even distort space. It had been stolen from a prestigious galactic museum on Xeris, and there was a considerable bounty on it. Quinn preferred jobs with a good payout. The dim light from neon signs flickered through the smog, casting an eerie, washed-out glow over the marketplace. Quinn's gaze wandered across the faces around him. Most were human, with a few alien species he recognized, and some he did not. But his attention snapped back as he noticed something unusual near the back of a dilapidated old warehouse. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring and shifting, their faces filled with anticipation and something darker. Quinn edged closer, curiosity overtaking him. There, on a raised platform and bound in heavy iron chains, stood a woman with skin the color of sapphires. Her arms and legs were secured, and around her neck hung a rusted chain that seemed more for intimidation than restraint. She wore only a rough, tattered top and bottoms that barely served their purpose. Her face, despite everything, held an expression of fierce defiance. A deep scowl was directed at the auctioneer and everyone who dared to look at her. The auctioneer, a slimy little man with a high, rasping voice, clapped his hands. Here she is, a true exotic specimen, a pure-blood Tawar, strong, unyielding, and blue as the day is long. Imagine the possibilities, he cackled, as the crowd murmured, tossing out bids and numbers. Quinn's fists clenched. This was no place for anyone to be treated like that, not even someone from a world he barely understood. He glanced at her face again and met her gaze. She looked at him with sharp, dagger-like eyes, as if daring him to try anything. She didn't seem like she wanted saving, but still, he couldn't just walk away. He reached into his pocket, feeling the last few credits he had on him. 10,000 credits! He shouted over the crowd, his voice cutting through the chatter. The auctioneer stopped mid-cackle, eyes widening. The murmurs ceased. Quinn felt every eye on him, most of them dubious or outright hostile. 10,000 was enough to cover a few ship repairs at least. But right now he figured that wasn't a price too high to keep his conscience clear. The auctioneer narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious of Quinn's intentions. But money was money. Sold, he declared, trying to hide his disappointment that there hadn't been a bidding war. With a grumble, he waved Quinn forward to collect his purchase. Quinn walked up the platform and unlocked the chains, and the blue-skinned woman stumbled forward, her defiance faltering just slightly. She fixed him with an appraising look. "Don't think I'm grateful," she said, her voice low and laced with venom. "Wouldn't dream of it," Quinn muttered back, half smiling. "Though we need to get moving, unless you'd rather see what other bids had in mind for you." He led her off the platform and into the shadows of Sura's winding back streets. The crowd's curiosity had faded, though a few sneers and glares followed them as they slipped into the maze of alleys. "Name's Quinn," he offered once they'd found a quieter, deserted alley. "And you?" She folded her arms, her face skeptical, lips pressed into a thin line. "Tech," she said, as if conceding information to an adversary. "I didn't ask for your help, human, figured," Quinn replied, crossing his own arms and leaning against a crumbling wall. "But you look like you needed it. Just figured you might be worth more than a price tag." Tech's gaze softened for a split second, but then the hardness returned. "And what now? You own me?" Quinn sighed, shaking his head. "Nope, you're free to go, but something tells me those guys aren't going to just forget about you. Unless you know your way around Kray's underbelly, it might be wise to stick with me, at least for now." She raised her chin, her expression a blend of pride and reluctance. After a long moment, she nodded. "Fine, but don't expect me to follow orders." Noted, Quinn grinned, his smile more genuine this time. She glared, and he swore he saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Come on, let's find somewhere to lay low." Navigating the alleyways proved to be more challenging than Quinn had anticipated. Despite her initial resistance, Tech's knowledge of Sura's hidden paths and dodgy vendors was impressive. She directed him through unmarked doors and led them down twisting stairwells that seemed designed to lose anyone unfamiliar with their labyrinthine structure. "Why did they want you so bad?" Quinn asked at one point as they slunk through a dimly lit corridor that reeked of decay. She kept her eyes ahead. "They see me as exotic," she said bitterly. "Tahari are rare in this sector, rare and valuable. Or so they think." She paused, then added, "Our kind don't appreciate humans, for the most part." "Could have fooled me," Quinn said with a wry smile. Tech threw him a sidelong glance. "I said, for the most part." She gestured him to silence as they passed a pair of armed men slumped in a stupor, oblivious to their surroundings. Once clear, they entered an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. Inside, the two finally allowed themselves a moment to breathe. Teak leaned against a stack of old crates, her posture defensive but exhausted. Quinn watched her, noting the way she tried to maintain an air of strength despite everything. There was a certain pride in her, a will unbroken by chains or scorn. "So what's your story, Tech?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She looked away, considering, before she replied. "My story isn't for you, Quinn, but I'll say this. My people have survived many things. Humans aren't high on that list of dangers." He chuckled. "Good to know we're not a threat." She narrowed her eyes at him. "I wouldn't be so quick to celebrate," but there was a hint of a smile that slipped through, barely perceptible. For a while they talked, each guarded but intrigued by the other. Quinn shared tales of his bounty hunting adventures, his humor easing the tension between them. She seemed less skeptical with each story, though her distrust lingered like a shadow that couldn't quite leave her. Nightfall crept over Sura, casting long shadows across the warehouse floor. Outside, neon lights from distant bars glowed faintly, the only reminders of the chaos they had left behind. Quinn and Tech sat together on a dusty crate, watching the stars visible through a broken skylight. "Strange, isn't it?" Quinn mused, breaking the silence. "That we come from different worlds, different lives, but we're both here in this moment." She scoffed lightly, though her eyes softened. "Humans and Tahari, such different paths. But you're not the worst of them." "Thanks, I think," he chuckled, nudging her playfully. Tech's laugh was almost shy, an unexpected sound that caught him off guard. She looked down, her usually piercing gaze softened. Silence settled over them, comfortable now, almost tender. She raised her hand to touch the back of his, her fingers feather light, then pulled away. "Do you always risk everything for strangers?" she asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Only the ones worth it," he murmured, leaning closer, and before he could overthink it, he kissed her. Her initial surprise faded, and she leaned into him, her hand moving to rest on his cheek, fingers brushing against his stubble. They broke apart only to meet each other's gaze. The grime, the danger, the scars each carried, it all fell away. Quinn and Tech sat together on the crate, the sounds of Sura's night settling around them in muffled hums and distant voices. But in that moment, nothing outside the warehouse seemed to matter. Her initial surprise at his kiss had faded, replaced with a slow, deepening response. She leaned into him, her fingers tracing over his roughened cheek, their touch gentle yet sure, her skin soft and warm. Despite its sapphire hue, it sent a jolt through him that reached past mere attraction, settling somewhere deeper. They broke apart briefly, staring at each other, breathing quietly. In sync, his hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with an ease that made it feel as though they'd done this 100 times before. Tech held his gaze, her eyes softening, an unspoken vulnerability flickering there. She looked almost fragile, a strange contrast to the defiance she'd worn like armor earlier that day. "You are so strange," she murmured, her voice low, almost reverent and stubborn. Quinn smiled, brushing a lock of her hair behind her ear. "Takes one to know one, doesn't it?" A faint smile crossed her lips. But she said nothing, letting the silence speak for her. Slowly, she leaned in, her face inches from his. She hesitated, then kissed him again, her touch bolder, more insistent. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and she melted against him, her tension dissolving. She pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes, and he could feel her breath, steady and warm against his cheek. Their movements were unhurried, as though both wanted to savor this fleeting moment. Her hand slipped from his face, tracing the lines of his shoulders, resting on his chest, fingers exploring the unfamiliar feel of him. Quinn's own hands slid along her back, pulling her close, memorizing the curve of her waist, the softness of her skin. He laid her gently onto the crate, his fingers moving to trace the fine line of her collarbone, pausing to feel her heartbeat, steady and strong beneath his fingertips. Telek's eyes met his, and she let out a shuddering breath, both a sigh and a soft laugh. "For someone so brash, you're surprisingly gentle, Quinn," he chuckled softly, his gaze meeting hers, brimming with warmth. "Guess you bring that out in me," he replied, brushing a soft kiss along her jaw, feeling her shiver in response. They moved together, an unspoken rhythm guiding them as they shared soft, intimate touches that felt both tender and electrifying. The space between them became charged, each glance, each caress like a bridge between worlds, as they held each other under the stars. It was as if everything that made them different, everything that set their worlds apart, faded into the quiet night. The dangers of Surata'ada, the uncertainty of tomorrow, the scars each of them carried from different pasts, all of it dissolved as they shared a connection that was pure, simple, and unexpected. The morning sun cast an amber glow through the broken skylight, waking Quinn from a surprisingly deep sleep. He opened his eyes to see Tech leaning against the window, her gaze fixed on the world outside. For a moment he simply watched her, content, a feeling he wasn't entirely used to. She turned, catching his eye, and smiled, a soft, fleeting expression that faded quickly when her gaze shifted to the street below. Her body tensed, and he followed her gaze, his heart sinking. A group of men prowled the streets, weapons drawn, moving with the cold precision of hired thugs. They were looking for someone. "They found us," she said, her voice flat but laced with tension. "Then we're moving now!" Quinn's voice was steady, though adrenaline was starting to pound through his veins. The two gathered their belongings in silence, their easy intimacy of the night before replaced with a shared determination as they slipped through a side door. They found themselves face to face with a trio of thugs blocking their path. The lead thug sneered, holding a weapon that crackled with energy. "Thought you could steal our prize and slip away, didn't you?" The thug sneered, eyes flicking between Quinn and Tech with a dangerous glint. Quinn tensed, ready to spring. But Tech stepped forward, her face a mask of defiance. "I am not anyone's prize," she said coldly, her voice a blade. With a swift, unexpected move she struck, disarming the lead thug and sending him staggering backward. Quinn jumped in, moving in sync with her, the two of them a practiced, fierce team as they took on the attackers. Blows flew, and Tech moved with a grace that made her look like she was dancing. Quinn fought beside her, every swing of his fist and block of an attack precise and powerful. They had each other's backs, unyielding in the face of their opponents. Finally, with the last thug groaning on the ground, they dashed into the alley, adrenaline still pulsing. They didn't stop running until they reached the outskirts of the city, where Quinn spotted a rickety old transport ship docked on a landing pad. He looked at Tech, and she gave a short nod, her expression a mix of determination and fear. They hurried up the ramp, and Quinn tapped a few quick commands on the console, powering up the engines. The transport shuddered to life, its aging frame groaning as it lifted off. As they broke through Sura's atmosphere, the planet's grimy landscape giving way to the endless stars, Tech let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since they first met. She turned to Quinn, her fierce expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Quinn glanced over, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Well, technically, you saved me back there. Call us even." She chuckled, rolling her eyes, but there was a warmth in her gaze, a gratitude that words couldn't fully express. They sat in silence, watching the stars, each lost in their own thoughts yet somehow profoundly connected. Finally she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Where will you go next, Quinn?" He shrugged, staring into the vastness of space. "Someplace that's not Sura. And, well, you're welcome to join me if you want." Tech looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I think I might like that." With a shared smile, they set their course into the stars, two unlikely allies bound by fate and adventure, heading toward whatever lay beyond.